Good morning, everybody. I first of all have to greet you all on behalf of our Director General, Ms. Irina Bokova, and also on behalf of UNESCO, not only my office in Venice, which is an office responsible for cooperation in Southeastern Europe mainly. When I received your invitation, I felt initially a bit uncomfortable because I'm not an economist, I'm not a policy analyst, I'm an agronomist. I work very much on the ground. I'm responsible for, have you seen, for several programs of UNESCO in this region, in particular the Man and Biosphere program and the Water program of UNESCO, with some activities in the field of education for sustainable development. I would say it's a more kind of soft intellectual part of the issues we are addressing today. But then, looking at what you were discussing and what I have to present, I found it was quite relevant to present you this. Because I see it all UNESCO's action in this field a kind of complementary dimension. You need to talk about, of course, investment and finance in big numbers to solve the issues we have heard about in the introductory session. But then I think we need the public, we need citizens, we need the business sector ready to act in a particular direction. And also, I think the public sector, when I look at the municipalities and institutions at the local level. And I think UNESCO's action, as I'll try to show you in a few minutes, is really dedicated to laying the ground for a common action in the direction we all agree is the one we have to take very urgently. And this action is very, very important. I've made several times this experience. I'm making a lot of educational activities in schools, for example, in high school. So I'm in front of an audience like this number of people, 100 young students, 18 years old in Italy, for example. And I just show them the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I just ask, have you ever seen this? Have you ever heard about these goals? And the reply was zero. No one in the audience had never heard about it. And the teachers were on the back, not on the front. And I said, shame on you, shame on you. This is not UNESCO's Philippe's goal. This is not the UN's goal. They are our goals. I mean, we are talking about the future of our planet and what we can do to change it, hopefully, or lead it in a good direction. And you should be concerned by that. And even more than me, but that's not true. That's something we were used to say. I have already gray hairs. A few years ago, we were used to say this is for the next generations. But we are the generation which is, myself included, which has to address all this very urgently. And if you look at the projections we have seen this morning, it's not about 2100, it's about 2020, 25, 30. And I hope we will all in this room still be living at that time. So that's a main concern. It gives you just the idea of the importance and the urgency of what we have to do also in the different field. You have to influence the politicians and those making the big finance decision, but we have also to influence each and every citizen around us. And UNESCO is dedicated to that because this is our mandate. I mean, that was what we proclaimed when we constituted in the Constitution, this is in the preamble of the Constitution of UNESCO, more than 70 years ago, after the Second World War. And so we want to work in the minds of people, men and women, and we build the defense of peace. Of course, today we have understood that, we've understood that there is a new way of thinking about that. There's no stability, there's no security, there's no peace without sustainable development. So if we address all this, it's because we want to build a kind of society without war, without instability, without big migrations and environmental disasters. So today, this is something which was said by our director, Irina Bokova, just back from Johannesburg's Rio Plus 20 conference. She said, no, if I should reformulate our mandate, this is our mandate. We have to learn and live within the environmental limits of our planet. It's a kind of definition of sustainable development, and so we are fully committed to work for that. But you see, it's in the learning realm that we have to work more as UNESCO. And we do that, of course, in the main sectors of UNESCO, education, We will come back to that, in particular education for sustainable, but not only. Before all, we need the education for all to be able to address education for sustainable development. We work in the field of science. I will show you very quickly a few examples of what we do in that field, also related to climate change. And of course, in culture, we have definitely been the champions of pushing in the agenda culture, creativity, diversity, not only the biological diversity in the agenda. But this is our approach, so we have to build the defense of peace, we have to build the idea of a sustainable world in the mind of people, so it's not a surprise that we even adopt this approach when we address climate change. And we don't change the climate, we try to change the minds of people, and that's quite a tough work, I can tell you. I just told you about my very recent experience in Italy in a school. And these are the 6 main domains where we do that, of course. We mobilize science, culture, knowledge is to know about the effects of climate change, to monitor it, to explore possibilities to mitigate effects. And from a scientific and cultural point of view, yes, of course, education, awareness, water security. We have a water program, which is quite important. I will show you a few examples of this action. Oceans are so important. I'm not the one to teach you about the importance in carbon sequestration, in the climate, the definition of a climate, the big masses movements in the water, in the air. Oceans are very much related to that. And then we see the effects in sea level rises, rising in all parts of the globe. We have also programs dedicated to social transformation and traditional indigenous knowledge, which is something I think quite important and not many are addressing. And finally, all this set of designated sites, and particularly why I'm here today, because we don't have only the World Heritage sites, but a lot of biosphere reserve, even here in this region, and geoparks, creative cities, and we are mobilizing all these networks, not only to monitor the effects of climate change on glaciers or historical cities, on lagoons. It's also about paving the way to a more sustainable society. We have communities committed to make a change where they live, and that's very important to consider. Okay. I have to be very quick. We have a lot of international scientific programs. As I told you, I'm working more for the International Hydrological Program dedicated to water and the Man and Biosphere Program. But as I told you, we have also this Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission program dedicated to geosciences. As I told you, local indigenous knowledge system, it's another program, and the management of social transformation, just to mention a few of them. Started from education. Yeah, I will not make a full description of what it should be. I'd like just to stress from my experience that our purpose is exactly to mobilize the new generations, to let them not being only aware of what are the problems and the issues are, because my experience is that when you address that, you have a quite important risk to, how could I say, leave your audience with a sense of incapacity to address so big issues. We are addressing that from a political, from international level. This is big. The problems are big, the solutions are big. This is for the G7, the G20, this is for the UN, this is for the EU. What can we do? And if you insist too much on the problems, then you leave your audience with this kind of sense of, I don't have the power to do anything. And I like any kind of educational, in the schools, non-formal activity, which can leave then that generation with a sense of, I have the power to do something, I have the power to change something. Because at the end of the day, the financing we are discussing today is touching people, communities, citizens who are consumers and voters. And so I've made activities where, using in fact the ecological footprint concept in a very detailed manner, to help them understanding what was the impact of each one of us on the planet, but also the capacity you have to make a change in what you decide to consume or not to consume. I've been in Ireland, for example, with groups of young girls making studies on cosmetics and discovering that there were some with micro peels, plastic, very particles of plastic in the just for your skin and care. And so they just were informing their fellows and say, you can choose. It's a question of consuming. So as young consumer, we can make a change. I've seen people working on other food products and palm oil and making a reflection on that and on many other aspects. They are consumers, but also voters. From 18 years old on, we vote in many of our countries. And you have, again, a chance to influence the politics in your country. And that's something, again, with the ecology footprint, they've realized. I mean, there are many things you can do by yourself. So the first level of action we need to mobilize, but there are many things you cannot do by yourself. I've seen very committed people making the calculation and say, okay, I'd like to be virtuous. So I will eat like that, heat my house like that, I will move only by, and then at the end of the day, my footprint is still very high. But yes, because you live in a particular country with a particular policy for energy, for transportation, for heating, for food. And so not all the effects can be decided by yourself. But as a voter, then you can ask now new politics, new policies for addressing better this aspect. And that's something you can mobilize already from the school. I like very much this kind of education. That's something we are doing in many countries and we'd like to further develop in this region. Not just air, or not just hot water, but I mean action. We have to lead people to act at different levels. First of all, individual, collective, community level, and even political level when they grow. I hope we prepare by doing this future generation ready also to work in the private sector, in institutions, which will have to deal with this kind of calculation, care about the carbon footprint and environmental assessment of their activities. So it's also a good education for the future. I told you about the water program, so we are now in science and water security. This hydrological program is running for more than 50 years now and still addressing many issues related also to climate change. So it means monitoring glaciers, monitoring dry lands, addressing droughts, floods, which are combined effects of climate change in many parts of the globe. We need forecasting, we need also knowledge base for policies in this field. And also for investment. I mean, if you don't have water, it's difficult to ask for investing in water-based energy production in particular countries. I told you about the ice and the glaciers. We have also now a new action called Ice Memory. It's a very urgent action we are launching with scientific partners because the continental glaciers in Europe and all parts of the world are disappearing. And one of the problems is that the memory of the planet is in the ice. It's a very fragile memory because if this ice melts, and then we lose this book with even some millions of years of record of the climate of the planet or the biology of the planet, and that's something we are trying to collect carats of ice, continental ice, and to keep it in the Antarctic basis. We have a kind of natural fridge there to keep them for even future research on the planet, climate, and biology. Ocean, I told you already, so very, very important global efforts led by the International Oceanographic Commission. You see, not just observing the ocean, but this is about the World Climate Research Program, Ocean Observation Panel for Climate. You see Global Sea Level Observing System, Ocean Biogeographic Information System, International Ocean Carbon Coordination Project. All this is related very closely to climate. I told you very briefly about this social transformation and dimension of climate change, or something we are addressing. I like to see this issue of traditional and local indigenous knowledge as something very complementary to our scientific approach to the issues, to the problem and issues related to climate change. I used to say that these people are acting, are living in a particular way. They have this kind of knowledge put in practice every day, and this is a knowledge they've gained from their practice and a particular way of living, and which was more resilient, more sustainable than ours very often. And so we have a lot to learn from them. And probably we have, first of all, to learn that all the knowledge now we are gaining through science, through technology, should be put a little bit more into practice. And then we would transform it in a kind of indigenous action. So they have the knowledge from their way of living and acting, and we have to learn from them how to apply what we know, and then mix, of course, all this knowledge and capacity to act in a different way. There's a lot of inspiration to gain from this. I've just been shocked by the data we have shared with FAO a few years ago, that still today 60 or even 70% of the food produced on the planet is still produced by traditional small family-based farming around the world. And they've discovered the hot air or the hot water again, that these communities, this way of doing was more resilient, had a higher capacity to adapt to change, to recover after a disaster. So there's a lot to learn, and even quite important, an importance to consider even in terms of food production and economic benefits. Yeah, I pass very quickly on the most program. There are a lot of social issues related to that. Migrations, the fact that a higher proportion of the world population is now living in big cities, in metropoles, and all the problems related to that. That's migrations is something which will impact a lot Europe. If you look at the major models for the future, or we make the big and quick change in the next years, how we will look at, we have to address a lot of social issues and migration. So to assure the coherence and the good distribution of the benefits of development all over Europe will not be such an easy issue in the future. And our sites, so very quickly, as I told you, they are not for me only a place where we can make some kind of scientific monitoring of climate change effects, but we have communities of people committed to make a change. And that's what we like to support and to highlight much more in the future. Don't think about even biosphere reserve as only very remote natural places with a few small communities around. Every day we have more important sites joining that network with big cities, even inside it, infrastructure, industry, transport, all our society well represented in all its sector. So it's not just about nature protection, man and biosphere. So we are looking much more at this relationship, this balance, and how to rebalance this relationship in a more sustainable way. And there are people doing it in very practical terms. It's a wide network, so there's an advantage to try to make a demonstration in any kind of environment, social, political, of course, natural, and historical one. We have worked, of course, as I told you, on the monitoring of climate change. So we have, throughout this network, we have made some surveys about climate change. If they feel, they observe, they're impacted by that, strongly or not, in which particular field are you worrying about that? So yeah, we can collect a few data. I will pass all this. You can find it on the web. Definitely in the past, they were presented, and we were insisting much more on the ecosystem approach and a definition of biosphere reserve in this way. So you're insisting on, the ecosystem dimension of and definition of the biosphere reserve. Today, we try to present them more as science for sustainability support sites, and it means we look at them as special places where nature and people try to work together. And yeah, just wanted to conclude with a few examples from what they do. The definition of how they are built around protected areas, but I mean, that's not relevant today. But I told you this already. We have shared with a few of you already some toolkits and material to make education for sustainable inside biosphere reserve, because it's a place where you can address much more than environmental education. You can address waste management, industrial production, you can address social issues. There are real places for real education for sustainable development. We work very much on gender equality. This is an example from Morocco where there's cooperatives of women making the production of the argan oil, which is very famous for cosmetics and not only. And they build their whole support on that. As I told you, learning from indigenous knowledge. In the cities of the Yemen, 3,000 years ago, they had already the toilet, the separation of dark and black and white waters, fertigation of the oasis around. I mean, there's a lot of techniques and approaches still to learn from them. As I told you, in this network, we don't just address nature-based production, but also eco-design, industry. So we have made, for the first time in one of the biosphere reserves 2 years ago, this first eco-design week ever in Italy, at least. So it was not an eco-design about clothes, fashion, cosmetics, and food. It was about to produce furniture, houses, mobility, energy. All this was addressed there. Tourism, of course, is a good way to valorize all these approaches at the territorial level, reducing inequalities. Just an example also of how communities in Europe can cooperate with communities in Africa, for example, to produce a particular kind of soap and sell it and support women cooperative and communities. I told you about the biosphere reserve incorporating more cities. This is one of the recent ones in Italy. This is Torino, Turin. So looking at the future, not in cars production anymore, but in culture, in environment, in sustainable development. So it's a large area in Italy looking at a new model for developing, looking at the surrounding areas as a place for, of course, nature, for landscape, for good products, but also having an influence on the way you live inside the city. So we have 1.5 million people looking at the more sustainable path for their development, looking at all these kind of resources. And that's quite exciting to look at a similar example. It will have a lot to see with mobility, with air pollution, with energy consumption, of course, with climate change too. I told you already about that ecological footprint as we apply it. But you see, biosphere reserve and climate action, for example, it is still the case of the Argan 3 biosphere reserve in Morocco, in the southern part of Morocco. This is the first barrier for them, for their government, against the desert and desertification. So fighting against the desert, drought, all these effects of climate change, and not only. And this is a biosphere reserve, assuring that's a very large one, the first barrier against that. Okay. That's roughly what I wanted to tell you about our combined action in different fields. I mean, the soft climate action, but I think very, very urgently needed. Last thing I wanted to tell you is that in September in Italy, we're organizing the first ever MAP Youth Forum. So it's an invitation to all young people. I've seen many here in the room. I know WWF, but not only, many associations and NGOs are working with young people, have projects around biosphere reserve, in different parts of the world, in different countries. So it's an invitation. For the first time ever, they will convene in a forum and they will have a possibility to discuss. We are committed to that kind of development. We need more attention. We need more support. We have all proposals to make inside important international arenas and programs. So if you have an idea that some people could come, have a few flyers to give you. And applications are still open for September. That will be a great moment. We will celebrate young champions for sustainable development all together. So thank you for your attention. Have a nice day.